Our featured speaker was Alexis Dudden from the History Department at the University of Connecticut. She's a specialist in Japanese and Korean history. She had been studying last year in Korea. Her talk was informal and she encouraged comments from the audience, so we stitched together portions of her talk.
But I'm looking at 2015 Tokyo. Japan has a remarkably active peace community. Japan has the best constitution in the world, right? It outlaws war. But not until 2015 was this tested in a new world sense. And 100,000 young Japanese took to the streets and said, we're not going to accept a change to our constitution. The reason I put that in this context is we need 100,000 young Americans in Washington tomorrow saying there's no war allowed in Korea. Because until we do that, and that's why the Olympics are our chance, all of a sudden I'm getting texts from friends who knew we were in Korea last year. Oh, wow, Pyeongchang's beautiful. Oh, the skiing looks great. Okay, let's take advantage of this situation, because all of a sudden a place that is just not on the radar for our friends is on television every day. In the mix, and as Johanna said this beautifully from Greece, how dare he not shake hands? The Olympics is about shaking hands. I was stunned, horrified, and I thought, wow, why couldn't you, okay, if you don't want to shake hands, but you have to look the enemy in the eye. If that's how you're conceiving it, if you're a hardline position. So a lot of this also as a teacher made me realize how little Americans understand about what happened in the 1950s. And in the 1950s, the United States, as Stanley Heller alluded to, we dropped more tonnage on North Korea in terms of destructive bombs than the sum total of the Asia-Pacific War. The United States annihilated what is North Korea today, and yet North Korea stands. And this is the problem and the calculus of dealing with North Korea. You have two countries now, South and North Korea, that have histories longer than Algeria. I mean, they've been countries longer than Algeria, but we don't think that way because it's Asia. So I think we're seeing a lot in the news about, well, young South Koreans don't want to march under the unification flag. So I wore my T-shirt from the 1990s. Sorry for the little extraordinary dance that I do here. But, okay, so this is the One Korea Festival. One Korea, right? Okay, so what's interesting about this is, where do you think the T-shirt's from?
China.
No, it's actually not made in China, but funny. The One Korea idea comes from Japan. And the One Korea, and Hanara, it's not really, it wasn't even a word in Korean in Korea, but something that came about post-colonial Korea in Japan. And this is something that is off the radar until tonight. Apparently, NBC, our network, is under fire for a comment made by its host at the opening ceremonies that Koreans were really grateful to the Japanese for economic inspiration, quote unquote. NBC has already apologized to the people of Korea. But this is also something to take advantage of. People don't know why Korea is divided. People don't know what the animosity stems from.
And they teach them in school?
They don't know that the Japanese prevented Koreans from learning Korean in school, and they had to give up their names. And my first dictionaries, I first went to Korea in 1986, and my first English-Korean dictionaries define civil war as the war between the states, i.e. the United States. You could not use the word civil war to define what had happened in Korea, because if you did, that defined you as a communist. And it denied you a visa. The most famous U.S. analysts of Korea that used the term civil war for 1950 to 53 were branded communist and not allowed in the country of South Korea. Fast forward to today, every young Korean, of course it was a civil war, who cares? We don't want to deal with their economic problems. And this is also what I'm asking us to think about, because one of the things that both Andy and I learned last year in Seoul that was really new for me, actually, is all of my students, highly educated, very smart, under the age of 25, do not want to pay for the merger of the two countries because we're talking $3 trillion. And they've got the highest youth unemployment. It'd be like telling Connecticut students that they all of a sudden needed to absorb the costs of something. What we have to do as people who understand that war is not an option, or the denial of human, existence is not an option, have to come up with a different language. And I would welcome your comments about what words to use. But in terms of Korean, and why I wear the One Korea t-shirt, is, okay, 1945, the empire collapses. There are 600,000 Koreans in Japan, both slave labor, forced labor, and also people who thought that was their economic chance. In the 1930s, they'd emigrated. It's a mess. It's disaster. Moved populations around and around, but the highest overseas Korean population for a long time is in Japan. All of a sudden, the war breaks out, and in the occupation of Japan under the United States in 1950, people of Korean ethnicity and birth had to pick a side. And a surprising number of people born in what today is South Korea picked affiliation with North Korea because of the imprimatur of American imperialism. Those people today are branded pro-North, pro-communist, pro-Kim regime, but they simply didn't want to be told by the United States in 1950, 1952, that they had to pick affiliation with a dictatorial pro-US regime. And again, this isn't an anti-American statement to make, it's simply what happened. And so you've got this overseas community in Japan that since 1950s has been promoting one Korea. This is Hanara, like one country. But today, for young South Koreans, it's a different mix. Their country is the 11th largest economy in the world. North Korea is less than Haiti. And they say, well, why am I giving up what my family fought for to pay for that? Besides, they're threatening, they're destabilizing everything, and I don't want to live like that. So it's not for me to judge, it's for me to say, okay, we need to come up with new language for what we're talking about. And that, when you talk about the handshake, I was blown away more that Pence did not stand up for unified Korea marching in. That, to me, was the ultimate disgrace, because how dare you? First of all, it's the host country. But if the United States wants to say, okay, well, the Kim regime is illegitimate, I'm not shaking her hand. Okay, a policy choice. I would not have made it, but a policy choice. But not to stand up for the human beings that are the athletes? It's the Olympics. It's about sport. It's not supposed to be about anything other than those people whose entire lives are sport. And that's where we just lost any credibility at all in terms of brokering anything other than war, which we know doesn't work as a policy. We can drop as much tonnage as we want. Dr. Marx brought onto the table this question of the bloody nose strategy. Do you guys know what the bloody nose... So, all right, bloody nose is a policy that is currently on the table, and I am scarier than I've ever been professionally, because I would argue we now have 50-50 in Washington. And bloody nose is a hyper-masculinist notion that if you go punch the other team, they're going to be so surprised they're not going to punch back. And that's why it's referred to as this, which is ironic insofar as the government of Imperial Japan in 1941 thought that the United States would be so surprised if they attacked Pearl Harbor, we wouldn't fight back. That didn't go so well for Japan, so it's a really bad decision to model on. But we're modeling on it because we're using nuclear weapons, and we're using these so-called new low-yield tactical smart bombs, which each one is the tonnage of a Hiroshima bomb. I was saying in my class this week in stores, I said, okay guys, I actually, I personally care where the world is going, so you know my politics. But if you voted for Trump, if you voted for Hillary, a nuclear bomb does not care, because it doesn't actually discern your politics. And I completely agree with you. Interesting in the mix is my 20-year-olds talk about school shootings. This is how they conceive of violence. They don't conceive of violence any other way, and this is the Sandy Hook generation. And they talk about this in terms of, well, what do you expect? We know we're about to die any time when we go to school. And it's something I really hadn't thought about. So I agree with you. If they
feel like that?
That's how they're taught before they get to college, and since there's no draft, and a lot of them also are paying for college by joining the military, which is a flip of the GI Bill of old. So it's, we've got a lot going against us in terms of reaching them. I don't think the 20-year-olds are unreachable, but as we've been talking about, I don't think it's not part of the curriculum right now. Students, I have at the moment 35 students in a class on nuclear history. One in 8th grade read John Hersey's Hiroshima. None of the rest had even heard it existed. And that used to be required reading. I mean, we all read it. But that's out of the picture, and yet school shootings are what they train for. So in the mix, I have many students who are veterans or active duty going to Iraq and Afghanistan. So, okay, here's another war. And on top of that, one has to explain, well, but nuclear is different. This is a different thing that we're throwing into the mix. We're talking about, the complete annihilation, not just of a population, but the soil, the water, the air. And so we've got something else going on that we have to reach a new world. Check on it. I look at it this way. North and South Korea are the first countries on the planet to come into being after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as states, as distinct states. So if you take that as a baseline, then of course North Korea went on a nuclear weapons program. And we can talk about why North Korea chose this, but if we want to talk optimistically for a second, maybe if I can get to what you wanted me to speak about, which was having hope, because I'm so upset that he didn't stand up for the team, because that really confirmed to me we don't have a policy other than to destroy, which, as we know, is not a policy.
And he has all these wars that are going, and then the young people have been raised in violence at home. 30,000 people died from guns violence in the United States. With mass shootings is just, let's pray and thought and blah blah and put a yellow ribbon and all that kind of stuff. So I guess they're immune to it. Because there's so much violence.
There's so much violence. There's so much violence they don't know where to start. Yeah. So if we can show them that there's a way, and again, this is where it's in each of our interests to take advantage of these pictures of Korea, of beautiful Korea, and say, these are people that, one team developed nuclear weapons. South Korea could have nuclear weapons on its own in about 2 weeks. It's not as if their physicists are stupid. They've just been told they're not allowed to have them by the United States, so they don't have them. And same with Japan. I mean, we're really not talking about a people not prepared to develop this technology. But they have chosen specifically, not different from Japan, the United States military is not allowed to station nuclear weapons in South Korean territory, precisely so South Korea has the ability to say to the North, we don't have them, so you can't have them either. Japan has them insofar as the United States stations its weapons in its bases there. And this is a subtle difference in terms of occupation, sort of military occupation policies, but it's real. So South Korea, Moon Jae-in in particular, this is a really interesting president, right? He is arguably the first legitimate president that South Korea has in its 60-plus year history, in that he was... he is the child of North Korean refugees. He grew up in a way that dirt poor used to be an expression. His one-room house on an island on dirt without a toilet counts as dirt poor growing up. He managed to go to Catholic school. He is a devout Catholic because those are the people who took care of him. He's also special forces. Last year during the election campaign, when he was asked would he defend his country from North Korea, he got out whatever a single reflex rifle is, and he got on television and says, the first North Korean that attacks South Korea, I will kill. I mean, this is not a pacifist by any definition of the word, nor is he an appeaser, but to say that he is, pro-North, which is what the peaceful outcome crowd refers to him as, he's pro-North because his family is North Korean. I mean, could you be anti-Massachusetts if your family came from Massachusetts? It's that ridiculous at that level. He is anti-war because any military confrontation on the Korean Peninsula is the decimation of his capital city, his economic base, and Korea. And so he has to figure out how to explain to young South Koreans that being in favor of peace is in favor of Korea's safety and future, not a communist appeasement, which unfortunately is what the Trump administration is rebranding any unification discussion as. And hopefully the global community can watch these Olympics and say, look, here's the chance. Let's work together with Korea as the world community to say, North Korea, come on. We know you have nuclear weapons. We know why you have nuclear weapons. It's because the United States is threatening you. They're scared of that, and they've achieved a different reality, right? This isn't the Cold War, and I think that's what South Korea is trying to say to the world. We understand maybe why this once existed, but it isn't the future, and it certainly isn't the future economically. And maybe that's also something that none of us is really predisposed to arguing, like, no, this is good for the world stock market. But we had a little hiccup this week in 401k plans. We would see the decimation of 401k plans if there were nuclear war in North Korea. And maybe that would appeal to other people. I'm honestly asking your advice.
So where's the rationality?
I think you put that beautifully. And I wish you could write that as a poem. Because there are 4 things that I counted that I would love to amplify. But when you say, where's the rationality, the first problem is that the term rational has been stolen from you. And in the sense that what you just said is in international relations theory defined as irrational. And the problem is you just spoke truth to power, which is a rational proposition. And I think, when we deal with disciplinary approaches, when we deal with bureaucratic entrenched proposals, the rational proposal is often defined as either idealist or pipe dream or lefty. But in fact, what you just said is the most realist proposition out there. Why wouldn't North Korea have nuclear weapons? In terms of planning, rational planning, of course they will have nuclear weapons. I'm in complete concurrence, even though I'm opposed to nuclear weapons, but that in 1945, but especially by 1953, if you are a state planner, it's clear that the only definition of state sovereignty is possession of nuclear weapons. And so you're going to begin as a state planner to do this, which leads to my second point to some of your questions, racism. Pure and simple. We didn't think they could do it. And that even was demonstrated November 29th with North Korea's latest missile test. This, right after Thanksgiving, North Korea achieved an altitude trajectory. How did they do that, was the question. They, being Asian, Korean, other, they did that because, wow, they're pretty good at science. How is science not really knowing racial boundaries? Where does the question come from? The question stems from the idea that if it's not a white man, it's not going to do it. And I'm not trying to, I don't mean any disrespect. What I'm saying is there is a policy, I think Dean Rusk is probably most on record, maybe tongue-in-cheek, maybe not, but he's referring to Dean Acheson talking about, quote-unquote, brown, yellow, little men. And that kind of policy planning was embodied in Mike Pence not standing up the other day in Pyeongchang. Stand up, you're in the host country. Would he have done that in Latvia? I don't know. They're white. But there's this, we can denigrate Asia, and they couldn't possibly come up with a nuclear weapon. I'm sorry, did anybody look at the 1988 differences in literacy in North and South Korea? There was none. I think in 1988, the last time there was an Olympics in Korea, South Korea, the literacy rate in South and North Korea was about 99%, which should humble all of us in Connecticut. And, these are people winning annual math and physics prizes internationally. So the idea that they came up with a nuclear weapon should be a non-starter, but continues to invade thinking in Washington.
Racism.
It's racism. Honestly, this boils down to racism in answer to your question, where's the rational thinking? Well, they couldn't do it.
Well, racism is not an adequate explanation.
I know,
because
right,
we
so it's
still have the
part of
same-
it. We're getting,
No,
so
it's
we've
just a shithole
got the
country.
history of it, we've got the economics. The economics is also really significant. In 1945, the North and the South had very different realities coming into being. Kim Jong-un's grandfather, Kim Il-sung, was arguably a pretty legitimate founder of a country because he had been a so-called freedom fighter in Manchuria. He had fought against Japan as a young man. He was 27, 28, 29. He founded North Korea when he was 33 years old. He had charisma. He had actually used bullets against the enemy. Meanwhile, in the South, we had an almost octogenarian who had spent 4 decades at Princeton University and in Washington who could not speak Korean when the United States airlifted him into Seoul in the body of Syngman Rhee. And so you have these very bipolar foundations to the country. Kim Il-sung in the North took a brutal approach to entrenching himself among his people, which was that he totally purged collaborators with the Japanese, former landowners, Christians, so that the first wave of refugees in Korean history, really, were people from North Korea fleeing south because they had worked for Japan. And Kim Il-sung was executing people right, left, and center. At the same time in the South, the American-backed Syngman Rhee had no legitimacy. He, again, could barely speak the language, but on top of that, no South Korean was welcoming him other than those who had worked for the Japanese overlords. And in that, he picked the people still wearing Japanese uniforms in the police, in the military, and we see this today in Iraq and Afghanistan. This is what the United States does. We pick the people on the ground already holding weapons to prove our policies and entrench them. And so in that, we haven't learned much, but those are the foundations. And I guess why I said earlier, and I'm sorry if I've gone on too long, but when I said earlier that last year when the current president of South Korea, who had the courage to shake hands with Kim Jong-un's younger sister, he had the courage to say, okay, you're my enemy, but I've got to know you. He has come through this entire post-colonial history to be South Korean and say, okay, it's time for us not to worry about the first half of the 20th century, but to worry about the future of the 21st century, which is precisely arguably why he recognizes he has to shake hands with the enemy. Because without that, there's only annihilation, which in my definition of rationality is irrational.
He's a Christian man too.
He's Christian, he's Korean,
No, well,
he's
yeah.
also a pragmatist, and it's interesting, he's defined in international press as a human rights lawyer, but I think in Korean terms that means he's civil rights. And so if we could sort of think about the 1960s and civil rights, the United States, that's who we're dealing with. We're dealing with somebody who came through the struggle for South Korea in South Korea. So there was a civil war between North and South, 50 to 53, but there was also an extended play civil war in South Korea from 1953 to 1993. And that's the background of the man who is the current president, who sees South Korea as a viable country. And that's also, and I'll shut up after this sentence, that's what we need to think about in terms of what we advocate for Korea. Young South Koreans do not want a unified country in terms of one country. We're not talking about the German model. We're not even talking Vietnam. They want a two-state system, maybe even passports. They know they have the same holidays and the same language, and the territory really is the size of Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island, but the economies are bipolar. And they don't feel anymore as if they are the same. Because of capitalism, North Korea is as capitalist. I mean, it's tied to the system. Thus, the sanctions matter. But at the same time, these are separate places. And I've spoken with North Korean defectors who, you know, I say, so where do you see yourself in 20 years? These are 24-year-old North Korean defectors. And I define defector and refugee differently. But a kid who's been in the North Korean army, who's crawled across the 38th parallel, across intensely high voltage wires, which is, you know, the definition of that divide. And I said, where do you see yourself? South or North Korea? In North Korea, building a better North Korea. So that's also something to consider, is North Koreans may not, it's very difficult to talk to a North Korean, but they arguably don't see themselves in the same light as South Koreans. So, okay, so they have two states. Is that workable? And I have disagreed professionally with Victor Cha, the person who's been passed over for ambassador for South Korea. I've disagreed with him on stage, on TV, publicly for the last 30 years of my life. He's my 10-year senior in my world, so he's not like, you don't call him a friend, you call him your senior. But the fact that he, Mr. Hawk, rejected the bloody nose strategy and he is not any longer being considered ambassador is terrifying. And that is what is all of a sudden energized rational thinkers in Washington, because if Victor, who has spent his entire life waiting for this moment, who is hardline, cordon them off, deny them power, whoa, you guys are actually going to bomb them, and he's rejected, it is absolutely horrifying.
If I may continue in all due respect, that it was the Democrats who escalated Vietnam.
Yeah.
It was the Democrats who bombed Yugoslavia and destroyed that country. And once they got what they wanted in Yugoslavia, they bankrolled Kostunica, you know, who did their bidding.
Sure.
So,
And it was a Democratic president who signed Promesa. If you guys don't know, I'll let you know in a minute.
But exactly, no, but I mean, so the point is, we're not talking Democrat and Republican. We are talking, we cannot, as American citizens, allow our country to commit first strike nuclear war.
yeah.
It just comes down to that.